It's been over a century now since the borders of the Middle East were drawn, mainly by imperialist powers, particularly Britain and France, in the waning days of the Ottoman Empire before its collapse. In 1915, 1916, during the First World War, they came together in the infamous Sykes-Picot Agreement, in which arbitrarily they redraw the map of the Middle East. Many of the drawings of these borders that came to be known as the nation-state system with the Arab states were arbitrarily drawn in order to preserve the interests of imperialist powers rather than the interests of the people of the area. And initially they were devising certain countries based on ethnic and confessional lines. At any rate, what happened is that by World War II, most of these Arab provinces that belonged to the Ottoman Empire, that were all living for centuries together in peace and harmony and a political order, they became different states to the tune of 22 Arab states.
At the beginning of the 20th century, there has been a rearrangement of the map of the Arab world. And Laura Robson wrote in her book States of Separation that was published recently about how there was a huge dislocation and changes in the demography and moving people around during the British and French occupation of the countries in the Middle East by the beginning of the 20th century. After World War I, not only because of Sykes-Picot, but also because of the deliberate resettlement and relocation of minorities to manage the new states and to create sometimes even pockets of problems and crisis to be able to interfere later in that. This happened with Palestine and the Zionist movement. This happened with the Armenians. This happened with sometimes the Kurds as well. So there was a lot of change of the map on the ground before the borders were set on the maps.
We need to keep in mind also that these countries that came together were weak countries. They were not independent. They depended pretty much on the imperial power that established them. And they were pushed by imperialist powers to be in charge without putting into consideration any kinds of structures that would preserve the history and heritage. So we found that these nation-state systems were not sustainable. In many instances, they had to face many challenges. The first challenge is the challenge of legitimacy. The second challenge is the challenge of identity. The other problem is the creation of the State of Israel. Clearly, this has been one of the central challenges that the Arab system had to face in the past 7 decades.
Through the rest of the Cold War, this was a topic that was off limits. America and its allies were not willing or not friendly towards the idea of borders being changed anywhere. And revisionism, the term revisionist state, or a state that was against the status quo, this sort of state was a state that was viewed with distaste, with animosity, we could say, during the Cold War. It was something that wasn't brought up. But after the end of the Cold War, this seems to have changed. And the event which, to me, seems to symbolize that for the United States, revisionism became something that was once again an idea that they would think about, or a policy that they might support in certain situations, was of course Kosovo. Because the United States was the main power that made the emergence of the Kosovo state possible. In the end, the United States supported a revision of territorial boundaries in the Balkans. This means that in the end, the United States became a state which now saw revision of borders as something that could be possible in certain situations. Once the United States said that, okay, borders are up for changes, once again, this means that everyone gets the message. For example, Russia. In the 1990s, of course, Russia had already established a de facto protectorate over Abkhazia. Russia, of course, supported Armenia in Armenia's occupation of the Nagorno-Karabakh region, which belongs to Azerbaijan, of course. But it's Russian power that makes Armenia's position on this issue very stable, very solid. So, of course, these issues were not exactly the same because they were very, very, in the grand scheme of the globe, they were pretty minor issues that cropped up in the 1990s.
Of course, now with the wars going on, actually since the first Gulf War, and then the second one, and then the situation in Syria, the war in Syria, maps are redrawn. And even if they are on the map itself not redrawn, but on the ground, politically speaking, there are so many maps being changed now. Minorities and majorities, etc. You have now 8 million, almost 8 million Syrians outside Syria. There are now laws being drafted to prevent many of them from going back. If you stay out of the country for a number of years, you will not have the right to reclaim your property. And hence, this change will basically create new states with new balances between the different ethnic and religious minorities. In the case of Egypt, Egypt has changed some of its borders in the Mediterranean, Eastern Mediterraneans, and also when it comes to Tiran and Sanafir, the two islands. And there is on and off going debate between Egypt and Sudan regarding Halaib and Shalatin area in the south. So even if there is no war, borders are subject now here and there to change. What will come out of it, it depends on the case that we are addressing. You cannot generalize in the Arab world broadly.
So what is happening in the past few years, we could tell, is the attempt to redraw the maps of the Middle East that will further weaken these states. These states are already weak because they are no longer able to bring together the resources and the populations by which they can have a new social order or social contract in order to become regional powers that is capable of addressing the major challenges that the people face. Rather, they have become states that can only cater to the ruling elites, especially in monarchies, or where you have oil-based economies, where a minority of the people would benefit from this oil, or in other countries where the main battle lines have become along confessional and ethnic lines, as we have seen in Iraq and most recently in Syria. We saw that Iraq that has not really suffered from any kind of sectarian wars or sectarianism as we have seen it throughout the first decade of the century. And that was directly related to the American invasion, where the people who were ruling Iraq after the invasion insisted in structuring a political order that will be based on sectarian and ethnic lines. And that has affected Iraq to the point that we certainly do not see a functioning state. It's a failed state, and it's a state that was deliberately pushed to have the major factor as being to which sect a person belonged, rather than whether the integrity and the interest of the Iraqi state. We also see today that there are many places in the Middle East, whether in Yemen or Libya or Syria or other places, where you have these continuous civil wars that are also based on tribal, ethnic, and sectarian and confessional lines in order to maintain the weakness of the Arab order and create a new set of states that would always look up to an outside force as a protector and patron, and therefore it will weaken the whole regime, which in return would give rise to those powers that can actually control the areas, in particular, in this case, Israel.
The invasion of Iraq created political instability in Iraq after the removal of the Saddam Hussein regime. And even 10 years ago, there were various observers, especially in the United States, floating suggestions about splitting Iraq into 3 different regional states, for a Kurdish state in the north, and then maybe a Sunni Arab state in the center part, and then from Baghdad to the south, a Shia Arab state. And so these sorts of ideas have been cropping up for the past 10 years. And then in the past 5 to 6 years, with the American partnership with, there's a number of acronyms that are being used, whether the YPG or the PYD or the PKK, with an organization that in the end is actually designated as a terrorist organization by the United States government. And it seems to be that because the PKK and their related organizations have an organization that can be used on the ground in Syria and then, of course, in other parts of this region, it seems that they had a long-term idea of establishing some sort of proto-state based on the PKK's organization in northern Syria. So even though, because of what Turkey has done, whether in Operation Euphrates Shield or in Operation Olive Branch or most recently in Operation Peace Spring, this seems to have been put on the back burner, hopefully. But now, in the past 6 years, the United States has chosen to partner itself with an organization that is a terrorist organization and whose stated goal is to break off chunks of Turkish territory in order to found its own state. In partnering with the PKK and in partnering with a force that sees itself as a rightful heir to being able to, or to politically controlling sections of territory that now belong to Turkey or to Syria. So for me as an American citizen, this is something extremely disappointing. It seems very logical to me that the Turkish leadership has to begin questioning this relationship.